My name is Allison Gladfelter. I'm a speech-language pathology associate faculty here at NIU and one of the co-directors of CISLL. First, I just wanted to say thanks so much for coming to CISLL's annual retreat. This is our plan for today. We have our keynote presentation, present our COSA and COFA awards, announce our PopGrant recipients. Then we have our additional presentations from our COSA and a previous PopGrant recipient, and then we'll wrap up for the day. I'll start with a few brief introductions of CISLL's team. So, as I mentioned, my name is Allison Gladfelter, and because CISLL is an interdisciplinary center, you can see that we have a lot of different disciplines represented, and it is following a co-leader model so that we have representation across different areas. So I'm thrilled to co-direct CISLL with Dr. Lindsay Harris in the educational psychology. I forgot your whole leadership foundation, EdPsych. It has 3 special interest groups that each have deputy directors. The first one is Julia Ogg. She's representing our diversity and language processing SIG. Mandy Ferretta Studenberg, hello, represents our second language learning and bilingualism SIG. And then unfortunately Melissa Klukas-Walter couldn't be here today, but she represents our learning within the disciplines and across the lifespan SIG. We have the fabulous Megan, our graduate assistant this year. Also, we are supported by Nicole Giardelli, who is our administrative assistant, and she makes all the behind-the-scenes stuff happen, so we're thrilled. So as a quick reminder, we have 3 special interest groups. The first is on diversity and language processing, which includes reading and language disabilities, special education, social relationship building as it relates to language or creating barriers, the social impact and labeling and discrimination. Our second SIG is second language learning and bilingualism, so national and international perspectives on language and literacy, the unique advantages and disadvantages facing speakers or learners of more than one language. And last but not least, learning within the disciplines and across the lifespan. So teaching and STEM learning, academic enablers such as motivation, school climate, social emotional factors, and social relationship building, and how language and literacy supports those endeavors. As part of our annual retreat, we're excited to sort of showcase some of the events that we've had throughout the year. We opened this year with a fall kickoff, and we were really excited to host for our keynote speaker at that event, Dr. Jen Krisman, who studies in the audiology department at Northwestern University, and she shared with us information about how the languages that we know influence how we listen. We also had our first ever then podcast with Dr. Krisman and CISLL affiliate Miliana Buwatch, which was a delight. We then had a fall show and share, which is 3 CISLL affiliate lightning talks. For our winter colloquium, we were thrilled to host Dr. Gary Lupian from Wisconsin-Madison, and he presented on cognitive relationships with language. We also had another spring CISLL show and share, and another CISLL Presents podcast. So those were some lovely research highlights from the year. We were also excited to be at the NIU Campus Child Care Center for our Literacy on the Lawn event, where we gave all of the families free children's books. Student affiliates promoted information on incorporating literacy into bedtime routines, supporting language and literacy at home, and of course the lovely bounce house that I think the kids were like, thanks for the book, but let me get to this bounce house. I am thrilled to be introducing Dr. Yvette Hyter. She is a certified speech-language pathologist and researcher. She is also an ASHA honoree, which for those of you who are not speech-language pathologists, that is the highest level of honors that you can receive from our national organization. So we are in the presence of a celebrity. She is also professor emerita at Western Michigan University, and her work has focused on trauma-informed and culturally responsive practices. She has co-authored a textbook on culturally responsive methods and edited a book on language research in post-traumatic stress. Her work also focuses on social pragmatics in African American children. She co-directs the Resiliency Center for Families and Children. She owns Language and Literacy Practices, LLC, and a Trauma Institute for Children and Communication. She is a founding member of the SLHS Equity Action Collective, whose members established an open access journal called the Journal of Critical Studies of Communication and Disability, and who are transforming scholarship, practice, and policy using critical science, equity, and social justice. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Yvette Hyter.
Thank you for that introduction, and thank you for the opportunity to share a brief introduction about trauma and its impact on language and literacy. I want to start with talking about trauma and its causes, but I usually give you an introduction to what it might be like in the life of a child. And so I want you to keep this child in mind as we go through the talk today. And this is Sam. His name has been changed and some circumstances have been changed to protect his privacy. But Sam is 10 years old, and he finally got the nerve after years to tell somebody about the abuse that he's been suffering at the hands of his father. He was sexually abused repeatedly. And so he finally disclosed that. They went through all of the channels. They removed him from his home, put him into foster care. Eventually, the case went to court, as is usually the case, and Sam had to testify in court, which is often usual for children who are old enough to do so. And so Sam was telling his story, the what, when, how, and where things happened. But his story was not coherent, meaning it wasn't informative. It didn't provide enough detail for the judge to understand exactly what happened. It wasn't cohesive, so it wasn't sequential. The pieces of the story didn't hang together. He had difficulty remembering some of the names of things, events. And then after Sam provided his testimony, his father testified. So the judge heard both sides of the story. The judge came back and said, Sam's story just is not credible, because the judge didn't understand the impact that trauma can have on the brain and the impact that that will have on language and communication. My trauma team intervened, we advocated, and he was not replaced with his father at that time. We eventually lost touch with him, so I'm not sure what happened down the line, but he needed an advocate to let people know that language is very important, but it's also impacted significantly by trauma. And I'm going to talk about why and how that looks. So what is trauma, and what are some of the causes of trauma? I like to use this water drop because it gives you an idea that there's an event or an experience or experiences. So that drop is the event, but the ripples are the impact that trauma has over the course of someone's life. And so really it's the ongoing impact of an event or an experience on your life. And this ongoing impact leaves you feeling hopeless, leaves you with a sense of overwhelm, feeling powerless, and a profound sense of loss. So it's the internalization of all of that. It's the internalization of that loss of safety, that profound sense of overwhelm and hopelessness that continues to impact people's perceptions of the world and also their development. I love the way Bessel van der Kolk put it. And Bessel van der Kolk is a psychiatrist who, if you're reading anything about trauma, you're going to read his name. He's very big in the area, and he wrote a book called The Body Keeps the Score. He describes trauma as the imprint that's left on the mind, the brain, and the body. And I think that is accurate because you hold trauma in your body. Even infants who might have been traumatized may not remember the trauma cognitively, but their body remembers it. Different types of trauma. There's acute trauma, which happens only once. Doesn't mean it has any less impact, right? So think about natural disaster or getting in a car accident. It happens once, but it can have some of the same results. Chronic trauma happens over again, it's ongoing. Think about bullying, which is on the rise in schools, children who are bullied. Also, war, being in combat, that's chronic, can cause chronic trauma. Complex trauma, this is the area that I have spent most of my time researching and working in, and this is the trauma that takes place in the caregiving system. That's the place where you should feel the most safe and protected, but you aren't, because it's happening within your home and your families with people that you know. And then usually that refers to maltreatment, which is sexual, physical, emotional abuse, and neglect. Vicarious trauma often happens to therapists. If you're working with this population of individuals who have trauma exposure, and then you're hearing a lot about these stories, you can be impacted and start having trauma symptoms if you do not process that information. Systemic trauma is the trauma that's sanctioned by society. And you're probably thinking, oh, society would never sanction trauma, but maybe not trauma, but the events that lead to it. For example, houselessness. Houselessness can be traumatizing. Being impoverished can be traumatizing. Systemic forms of exclusion like racism, heteronormativity, any other ism you can think of, that can be traumatizing. Sarah Haynes, who has a book called Politics of Trauma, describes systemic trauma as the ongoing violation, dismissal of, or deprivation of groups of people, state institutions, economic systems, and social norms systematically deny access to safety, access to mobility, access to resources, food, education, dignity, and positive reflections of themselves. All of those can result in systemic trauma because it interrupts someone's feelings of belonging and their self-perceptions. There's also historical trauma. Now, historical trauma, intergenerational trauma and collective trauma can be historical traumas. Historical traumas occur in history and also impacts entire cultural groups, racialized groups, or ethnic groups. So think about things like forced migration or dispossession of your land, of your language, of your culture. Colonialism, enslavement, those are examples of historical trauma. Intergenerational trauma can also be historical, but it usually happens within one whole family. So something happened to your great-grandfather, your grandfather, your father, and then your son. So you usually see those traumas in families, and often they refer to complex traumas, but not always, but complex traumas that happen within families across generations. And collective traumas also happen across multiple people, so groups of people experience these, but they don't have to be of the same racial, ethnic, or cultural group. Think about COVID. That happened recently, still happening, but all the people who lost loved ones as a result of that. Think about mass shootings. These are collective traumas that impact whole societies, right? And so we all are responding to that in different ways, talking about it, and some of us are bottling it up and not dealing with it, thinking, this is nothing. But these are also sources of trauma. Trauma has impacts on the brain. Trauma impacts the brain, negatively affects the brain. It changes the brain. It can have a significant change to the structure and the function of the brain. Trauma on the brain really is stress. So it's a lot of stress. There are different types of stress. There's positive stress, like getting ready for a presentation, making sure the slides work, all of that's stress. But it's, you recover from that. It does not activate your body's stress response system. Think about a child going to the doctor for the first time, or getting their first shot, or being left with a new caregiver for the very first time. Sorry, all of my examples are of young children and infants, so that's my area. I just automatically think about that. So that's positive stress. There is tolerable stress. Just what it means. It's tolerable. It does activate your body's stress system, but it can recover. You have a supportive environment, someone who is making you feel safe and protected. Think about a child suffering the loss of a friend, losing a grandmother maybe, or a classmate. That's stress, but with the supportive environment, they can recover. Their stress response activation system does fire up, but they can recover well. It doesn't just keep going. The third type of stress is the stress that we're talking about today, and that is toxic stress. Toxic stress is, in a word, toxic. This is a visual graphic, and I've borrowed some of the pictures or the example from Nadine Burke-Harris in the book, The Deepest Well. But this picture is one that I put together, what I think about happening in the brain that activates your stress response system. So first, you're in danger. Your body perceives that danger. Your stress hormones are prompted to fire off. You go through fight, flight, or freeze, right? We all have that sort of response. You decide to fly, so you're going to run. You get to safety. You get home. Whew, you're safe. You relax. Guess what? Stress hormones turn off. They don't turn back on until you're in danger again. You recover, you go about your life, you're fine. And that stress turns off as long as it's mitigated by this supportive environment, right? You're in toxic stress and you have this hormone and you can't get out of the situation that you're in. You cannot solve it. You can't do anything about it. You can't undo it. You can't protect yourself. You're in this constant stress feedback loop. So you have the danger. The stress hormones are continuously firing. So you're looking for danger everywhere you're going, right? You see it every place you go. You're constantly in that fight, flight, or freeze. Think about children in the classroom. Who's able to concentrate under that circumstance? Who's able to enter a play situation with their peers? Who's able to concentrate on what the teacher's instructions are? Can you imagine that? I'm going to talk a little bit about the brain and how stress looks on the brain. So the brain stem and the hypothalamus and the amygdala work together to regulate our bodies, right? So the brain stem helps us with breathing, helps us with the heart rate. The amygdala is in the limbic system, which is the fear center that helps us detect whether or not we should be afraid of something. It's shaped by experience. The hypothalamus works with the brainstem to help regulate our bodies, so it helps us have energy for just basic life functions. But they also prompt that fight, flight, or freeze response. So that's the first thing. When you're in danger, you sense danger, the fight hormones fire off, and then the brainstem, hypothalamus, and amygdala work together to promote that fight, flight, or freeze response. The limbic system, which Burke-Harris calls the fear center, it helps us regulate our emotions, and it has lots of different systems, but there are three that I want to focus on. One is the thalamus, because that's the relay center, right, in your brain. It intercepts all the incoming information into your brain and sensory information coming into your brain. It interprets it and sends it to where it's supposed to go. That's the thalamus. The amygdala helps you determine stressful situations. If we heard a loud noise, all of our brains would assess, should I be scared now? And then we're kind of looking around, we see that someone dropped their phone on the floor, and then, okay, so we go back, we're okay, right? But we are kind of get alert That's that amygdala's role, is to say, hey, you need to be scared of this, or not really, you don't need to be scared of this. And then the hippocampus is responsible for memory. When your amygdala senses danger, the amygdala sends a message to the hippocampus and says, guess what? We're not going to write any memories right now. We're not going to create memories. We're not going to store them very well. We don't have time for that. We're trying to survive. Also sends a message to the prefrontal cortex, and I'll get to that in a minute, that says we're not going to override any impulses, because what impulses that we have right now, we need them to survive. Think about Sam and his memory of events that actually happened to him, right? They were fragmented. He didn't have them all. He couldn't tell them in a way that someone else could make sense of it. Doesn't mean it didn't happen. The locus ceruleus is the primary area in our brains that synthesize norepinephrine. And norepinephrine is like adrenaline, but it's produced by the brain, right? And so if that structure is dysregulated, then you have issues with arousal. You're often hyper-aroused, overly focused. You have difficulty with attending to things in your environment. There's a word that I'm trying to figure out another word to use, so if anybody has any suggestions, I'm open. But aggression, I've been using reactivity, but I know that that doesn't quite explain because it means something else when OTs use it. But you have this level of high reactivity to environments and high levels of anxiety. So when your locus ceruleus is overstimulated, which happens in a stressed brain, you have high levels of anxiety, high levels of hyperreactivity, impulse control concerns. Think about the children in class who have difficulty sitting still, seem very anxious and unable to focus. It could be that their locus ceruleus is overstimulated. Prefrontal cortex. The prefrontal cortex is the brain's conductor. It helps us figure out things. It helps us plan and problem solve and make sense of our past experience. So we can think through, ooh, that didn't work out very well. I can do such and such differently. It's where our executive functions live. But the amygdala says to the prefrontal cortex, we don't have time to override impulses. Impulses are good right now. We're not overriding that because we're just trying to survive, right? We're not going to sit and plan and figure out things. You just have to do what you think is the best thing right now. That's where we are. But if your brain is in that toxic state of stress and you're in that constant feedback, danger, stress hormones, feedback loop, toxic stress feedback loop, your prefrontal cortex is always on pause, meaning the executive function pieces are turned off and not paying attention to impulses is turned on. Corpus callosum. This helps integrate your brain. You know, it's that fiber that it communicates between the left and the right hemispheres of the brain. But it tends to be small in children that have histories of maltreatment, particularly small in boys with neglect. Neglect didn't affect girls as much, interestingly. But guess what did? You can guess. Sexual abuse was more significant for the size of the corpus callosum in girls. But your brain needs to work together. Your left and right hemispheres need to work together for you to have an integrated brain. And this is critical for higher level language functions. That's just like a real speed through example of what can happen to the brain in that toxic stress feedback loop. And that's what's happening, right? So children aren't deciding that they're going to be dysregulated. I've often heard teachers say, oh, he could sit still if he wanted to. I've seen him sit still before. But guess what? He can't. He really cannot sit still, even if he wanted to, because his body is dictating that he's doing something else, right? That's what, for children who are have this very stressed brain, children and adults alike. And that's only one example. So it has an effect on language and literacy. So I want to talk a little bit about that. A student of mine did a study looking at the language of children with trauma histories that were coming to the clinic that we worked in. And then there's other articles, and I just have a sampling of some of those articles that talked about the impact that trauma has on language and literacy. So what we do know generally is that trauma impacts all levels of language, all aspects of language. And it also impacts literacy and social pragmatic communication. LUM, Canadian, I believe, this work was done in Canada. This is a group, LUM, and these authors in Canada who is doing some publications. And there's another person, I think he must be a professor, and these are his students. He's a prolific writer in Spain, his name is Juan Manuel Moreno Manso, and he has a lot of articles. So if you can read in Spanish, I can read in Spanish slowly, but I can read it. So he has a lot of articles in Spanish and some in English about the impact that trauma has on language. But Lum, Powell, Timms, and Pamela Snow did a meta-analysis looking at language of maltreated children. This was in 2015. And their research question focused on what was the relationship between maltreatment and vocabulary and language, comprehension and production. And what they found is that children, they had difficulty with receptive language on the PPBTR. We now know that that's an older version, but still, that's the one that was part of this meta-analysis, the articles that they reviewed use. They had lower receptive language, and that was based on tests of comprehension of language, which is primarily structural, so it's looking at syntax. The Miller-Yoder language comprehension test, so it's looking at receptive spoken vocabulary. So they had difficulty on those instruments, had lower receptive and lower than children that did not have the trauma experience. They had less effective expressive language, so that was through language samples. The preschool language scale was lower, and that syntactic was lower. The language samples showed that children had difficulty engaging in communication or conversations in ways that were consistent with the topic at hand. Another article to be aware of is Silvestre, Bouchard, and they did another meta-analysis looking at abused and neglected children. They did a comparison study examining whether or not the age and type of maltreatment was different based on maltreatment and language. They looked at receptive language, auditory comprehension, and expressive language. Instead of the language sample, they also focused on MLU, the mean length of utterance, and the speed of naming objects. And then they looked at conversational discourse. So now we're seeing some focus on pragmatics, when before even the articles that were done in the 1980s did not focus on pragmatics. So they looked at conversational discourse and pragmatics. All those areas of language were less well developed in children with histories of maltreatment than in their peers without those histories. Ciolino, who is a past student of mine, she looked at the narrative and other pragmatic language abilities, but also of language skills. In her article, these were the research questions, looking at semantic and syntactic findings, and then she also looked at narrative and expository text and conversation. She found that children with trauma exposure had deficits in narrative content, so they weren't very content heavy. It was difficult to figure out what it was they were talking about. Their expository structure was difficult to follow. Their expository content was difficult because they didn't provide enough information to understand what the child was explaining, and we did the favorite game or sport. That was the test. The number of maltreatment exposures did not impact performance. We had an average of children who had 8 maltreatment exposures. So that's an average. So the highest was like something like 15. The lowest was 2. The child that had 2 exposures performed the same as the child that had 15. It didn't impact. Now, some people will say, well, if you have an acute trauma, is that really trauma? Yes. Right? It happened once. If it was traumatizing, it's going to have the same effect. I will say, put a parenthesis here, we probably need more data to really say that, right? But from the data that I know and have collected, analyzed, the number of traumas don't impact. I want to underscore this for all the speech language clinicians here. The majority of children pass the CISLL screener. The CISLL screener is not easy to pass. So what does that say? That with language semantics and language structure, that children who have traumatized histories can pass a screening and look like they're not having difficulties. You have to include, you cannot overlook social pragmatic communication. In my estimation, that's where the real problem lies. Yes, they have some difficulty with language semantics, meaning, and vocabulary and syntax, word structure, sentence structure, but where the real issues lie, breakdown in schooling, is in social pragmatic communication. Crystal also didn't find any differences between gender or age. So in terms of the trauma affecting literacy, it causes cognitive impairments or cognitive disabilities, is probably a better word. And so it interferes with cognitive functioning. I'm going to talk a little bit about that when I talk about social pragmatic communication. It disrupts learning, so children with trauma histories often have inconsistent schooling. It can impact language development. We talked a little bit about what some of that language development might be. You can have physical health issues. Children often who have, and I keep saying children, but it's not just children, right? So anyone who has experienced a trauma, who has been traumatized by something, can have these experiences or these types of systematic disabilities or issues. Physical health issues, we see a lot of somatic complaints. So stomach aches, headaches, even when there's not a physiological reason for that can be identified. So you still see a lot of that. So it affects language, it affects learning opportunities. So all of these put together impacts literacy learning. Now we talked about language and literacy. I want to talk about social pragmatic communication, which is the area that and this is my professional opinion, think is the most impacted area with regard to communication. Although we know it also impacts language expression, language comprehension for vocabulary and semantics and syntax. That also includes word relationships, right? This model is something that I developed, just revised a little bit, that explains in my head how I envision or conceptualize social pragmatic communication. Social pragmatic communication is defined as being able to read a social situation and then engage effectively within that particular situation. And there are different components of social pragmatic communication, and this is a conceptual cognitive model, not a linguistic model, but a cognitive model, where I have the base being cognitive skills, and then you have pragmatics on top. But all of these pieces are required in order to engage in social pragmatic communication effectively. So social cognition is that ability to understand why people do what they do. So you think about theory of mind, think about perspective taking, think about understanding people's internal states. So I can look at Mandy and she's nodding her head, and that says to me, okay, she's interested. So if somebody else was sitting like this, I'm recognizing that internal state. I might not be accurate, but I'm thinking, oh, I'm not saying something clear, or this isn't making sense, So we're able to do these kind of, as Simon Baron-Cohen calls it, mind reading, to kind of get a sense of what people, because we're social beings and That's what we have learned. That's social cognition. Executive functions and regulation are in the same triangle, and I have this little dotted line because they depend on each other. So if your regulation is low, whether it's sensory, behavioral, or emotional regulation, your executive function skills are going to be low. If your regulation is high, your executive function skills are going to be higher. Memory, all aspects of memory are impacted. Working memory, autobiographical memory, semantic memory, emotional memory, all aspects of memory are impacted. And then pragmatics. And when I say pragmatics, I mean these three components. So discourse, which includes conversation, narrative and expository text, communicative functions, the reasons why we communicate. So if someone came in and a greeting is a communicative function. And then a presupposition, being able to make some presuppositions or presuppose what information you need to provide so that the listener can follow you, right? Something else that was missing with Sam's stories, right? So he didn't have that ability to presuppose what the judge needed to hear in order to understand his story fully. If any pieces of this model are missing, then the whole model doesn't quite stand. And so you have social pragmatic communication issues. I've mapped onto that model the areas of the brain that connect. These are not the only areas of the brain, of course, that impact social pragmatic communication. So you can see the direct link. This is the part of the brain that's impacted, and it directly relates to this part of social pragmatic communication. So if we think about the social cognition, it plays a role in fear. It helps us react to stressful situations. If the amygdala is chronically stressed, it not only gives messages to the hippocampus that we're not remembering things right now, and to the prefrontal cortex that we're not going to hold our impulses right now or check our impulses right now. It also starts to misread situations. So you're in this room, we've heard the fan running, I'm talking, everyone else is sitting quietly. But if you are a person whose amygdala is constantly on fire, this room feels very unsafe, right? And so you're hypervigilant. Sitting, maybe you don't feel comfortable sitting with your back to the door. You're constantly looking. So your amygdala then starts sending this message that this is not safe, right? So you get mixed messages. You all know the Berenstain Bears. That there's a book about I think it's called Stranger Danger or something like that, with the Berenstain Bears. Well, anyway, it has these lovely pictures. There's a big picture. The father bear is teaching the youngest girl bear about stranger danger, about not going with strangers and not speaking to people you don't know and all of that. And so there's this picture of how she was walking to the park with her father before having this talk, and the sun was out, everybody had a big smile on their face, the clown had a big smile, had beautiful balloons. But after this talk, she was walking through the same park, it's the same picture. The clown then had a frown, the balloons weren't bright yellow and blue and red, they were dark color, and the sun wasn't out, everything looked very scary. So that picture, that second picture, is a very good example of when your amygdala is constantly on fire and start sending these errant messages that everything looks dangerous. So emotional memory can be impacted because this is the memory for the emotions that you felt during an experience. So if you think about, I think about my first dance at my wedding. I didn't even feel like I had feet. It's just like I can remember all of that, like how I felt. Or if you're walking down the street and you trip and a whole bunch of people are standing around, that little feeling of, ooh, they saw me trip, or that feeling of embarrassment. You kind of remember those, right? But when amygdala plays a role in this emotional memory, If your amygdala is constantly on fire, you can experience those emotions outside of the context. So here's another story. A child that I was working with in a Head Start classroom. We all knew that she had some difficulties at home. It was a very chaotic life that she had, and she was seeing occupational therapy for regulation. She came back one day very peaceful. She was just feeling really good. You could tell. Was sitting at the table, playing with puzzles by herself, sitting quietly, and then someone just walked behind her chair. Her chair was here. And someone just walked behind her chair. Didn't touch the chair. It was simply, she saw the passage, but I could see the child's body tense up, and she didn't move, but I could see her eyes following this child. And when the child got on this side, she jumps up from her chair, too fast for me to get to her first, and started beating on the child that walked by. She saw that. She felt danger. Whether or not it was to anyone else, to her, she felt danger. And so she reacted as a way, and thank goodness we all understood that she was in survival mode at that point, right? So we did some repair with the child that was being attacked, and kind of helped her recenter herself. You can have those experiences. I think that she was probably triggered by something. Could be the movement, it could be the behind, somebody moving behind you instead of in front of you. It could be the color the child had on, we don't know, but something triggered her, and so she had that experience in that moment, even though she wasn't actually experiencing it. Trauma on social cognition, that I did a systematic review of the literature in 2021, and I found that children could learn theory of mind. It was just slower. It didn't develop at the same rate. They could learn internal state language. It just didn't develop at the same rate. They had significant difficulty predicting thoughts and feelings and perspective of others. So it was difficult for them to take that into consideration. The hippocampus deals with memory, all types of memory, formation, storing, collecting, organizing, connecting emotions to memory. Episodic memory, autobiographic, which is a type of episodic memory, which is very important. Now we know that we all, and this is universal, not just in the United States, but all over the world, people use stories as a way to work through their problems, right? In different ways. The story might have a different structure, might have a different content focus, but people do use stories to work through something. If I were to be talking now and knock the water over afterward, I'd be telling somebody that story to work through, like, what on earth happened? What was I thinking? What was I doing? So we use stories that way. So not having access to your own story has significant implications for resilience and recovery. When you are in therapy, often individuals that have trauma histories are in therapy. Therapy often uses what? Talk, language, and stories to try to work through some of those issues. Now, thank goodness, there are also expressive therapy. So art therapy, play therapy, music therapy that help people also work through. But by and large, there's lots of talk therapy and people using stories that children may not be able to access. There is, and I'm going to put a parenthesis here, there is a intervention called narrative exposure therapy. Anybody heard of that? Any psychologists? Yes. So narrative exposure therapy is something that is used and successful with children and adults that have experiences with trauma, and it helps them piece together their stories. It's developed by psychologists, even though there's a manual for how to do it, because you have to excavate some of the really bad and dangerous and painful stories that people are telling that are part of their development. I would not feel comfortable as a speech language clinician doing it on my own. I would want to partner because I have the language piece that I can help with, And the psychologist has the psychotherapy piece that would help that person recount all of those difficult moments in their life. But the point of the therapy is to end up with a cohesive autobiographical memory. It's 10 weeks for individuals, for adults, and there's a child version called KidNet, KIDNET. But I suspect for individuals that have language impairments or difficulties in social pragmatic communication as a result of their trauma, that it will take longer than 10 weeks. I don't think that's been studied. We just need more data. This chart comes from NICAM, the National Institute for Clinical Application of Behavioral Medicine. They have a plethora of infographics, pictures that explain what happens in the brain. And this is one that I adopted that I didn't include the pictures, but the wording I did is all about how trauma impacts memory. Autobiographical memory can shut down episodic memory. It prevents you from combining information about things in your environment to make semantic memories. It can trigger emotional memories, and also your procedural memory, just your regular knowledge of how to do something, can be changed or lost. As an example of that procedural memory, when I was in Head Start, this was several years ago, we went on lockdown. I had no idea why there was a lockdown. My mind has a tendency to hear things that don't necessarily exist when I'm under extreme stress. What I did know is that there were 3 of us, adults, in a classroom of 15 children, that we had to keep quiet and calm, and lights out. We were all hiding behind a piano. Not really hiding, but that was the only barrier that we had in the classroom. The door was locked, thank goodness. The window and the glass was covered. In my mind, I heard gunshots, I heard people screaming, I heard everything was going on. Right? None of that happened. That was what my mind was doing. And then I heard somebody rattling the door. And I made the decision. When you're in that moment, I thought, okay, so this is how it's going to happen. Okay, I made peace with that. I texted my sister. I said, call my husband. This is the situation. Don't call me back, because I didn't want the phone to ring. And I was planning to just cover all the children I could with my body. Flash forward, it seemed like it lasted forever. They lifted up the lockdown. It was a parent who was threatening, had a gun, but not at our center. It was at another Head Start center, and they just locked them all down. Whew. But afterwards, we were trying to pick up the room. I could not put together a puzzle. I couldn't do it. It was completely gone. And that lasted the whole day. I just went home and ended up going to bed. I was so exhausted. But I couldn't I couldn't really pick things up, so I wasn't being very helpful to the classroom teacher. There was a student, a speech language student, who was doing her practicum there, who had lockdown drills all of her schooling. She was beautiful, perfect. I just followed her example, and then I went home and went to bed. I was really shocked that I could not. My procedural memory for doing a simple preschool puzzle wiped away. Executive functions, we know what the executive functions do. The impact of trauma on executive functions, there's difficulty with spatial working memory. So children had difficulty remembering where they put things in space. They had difficulty engaging in behaviors that did not receive negative attention in their classrooms. But this was interesting. I was surprised at this, but then not really, that they were able to engage in set shifting in the similarity to their peers. So they were able to have cognitive flexibility. Have to always be on guard. You're more flexible because you might have to change what you're doing at any moment. That makes sense now. On regulation, these parts of the brain deal with regulation, the thalamus with sensory regulation, the limbic system with emotional regulation, and the prefrontal cortex with behavior regulation. And so all of these can be impacted. These are some of the data that shows some of the issues with sensory modulation. There are difficulties with internalizing and externalizing behaviors. Internalizing behaviors are things you can't see, like anxiety, depression. Externalizing behaviors are things you can see, like jumping on top of the table, knocking things over, hitting someone. So there's an over and under reactivity to touch. You could have decreased awareness or dissociation from sensations. It can manifest as hypervigilance or overreactivity, easily startled, and it impacts how you engage socially with others. Pragmatics, difficulty with communication functions we saw. We saw that they did not adapt the language to the needs of the listener, so they weren't using presupposition. Limited referential cohesion for people who are not speech-language clinicians. That means the ability to be clear about who you're talking about. So if I said the boy ran to the store, he picked up bread, that he refers to the boy. So being able to make those connections in your conversation or in your story, so they had limited referential cohesion. They weren't able to see things from other people's points of view. Their explanatory discourse was not structured in a way that could be followed or complete in a way that could be followed. They did present themselves as superhuman in their narratives. I was able to lift the car, or I was able to beat up 10 men, or I ran out and I saved my mother from the gun. And, so it's all these stories, which I think are ways of embellishing the story so that you can live with the outcome, trying to work through what actually happened. In a formalized test by Gillum and Pearson, the test of narrative language, they had a below average index of narrative ability. And something else that we all need to be aware of is that these children were highly susceptible to suggestions. Saying, wow, that was a fun game, right? They'll say, yeah, even though it might not have been, right? So they're highly susceptible to suggestions. That is like a speed through, brief introduction to the impact of trauma on language and literacy and social pragmatic communication. So the question was, in one of my slides, there was something about the relationship between fear and pleasure, and can pleasure trigger the PTSD? If pleasure is connected, if there's something fun or pleasurable connected with something traumatizing, then it can be triggered. I worry about using this example. It's about child sex abuse. So I'm hoping if you feel like you need to leave for this part or cover your ears or do something else, please do. But there are children who have been children, like 5, 6, 7-year-old, who have been sexually abused, who their bodies remember what some might call, what an adult would call pleasure, that you have when you have sexual relations. But it triggers them negatively because they don't understand what's happening in their body. Does that make sense? If your amygdala is constantly firing, you can start mixing up what is fearful versus what is not fearful and or pleasurable. That can happen if you're in this toxic brain state where the amygdala is constantly firing. It can mix things up. We see that often with when people are triggered in certain circumstances, that they're in a fun environment or an environment that could be fun, but they're having a negative experience because their brain is telling them that this is something they need to fear. The effects on adults is you have the same outcomes, although adults they understand what has happened to them better than children would have understand what's happened to them. So that psychological piece is not there in children, but you have very similar outcomes. my area of focus has not been on adults, so I can speak better to how it impacts children. Some of the behaviors, symptoms might be different because we can mask. We can mask our anxiety better. We can mask our fear better. We can just decide, okay, I'm not going to go there. I'm not going to attend that function. So as adults, there are things that we can do where our anxiety and our dysregulation may not be so obvious to others in the environment, that children don't have the tools to do automatically, but the impact is the same. I also wonder if the being able to manage is also having more resources to manage those, and it feels bad because you're not being authentic in that moment. You're not addressing what's dealing with in that particular moment, but you do have more resources than children have to be able to figure. Like you said, the child going bananas in Walmart, because he doesn't have the resources to say, okay, I'm in Walmart, I can't do this now, I have to wait till I get to the place. You know what I mean? You can be traumatized, but how you're traumatized or how it impacts your life can depend on the protective factors or your experiences. Dan Siegel, who is another trauma guru person, gives an example. Like, if you are a race car driver and you have a car accident and you flip over and you get up from there, you may get up and walk away and, oh, glad I got out of that, and not be traumatized by that experience at all, because you're a race car driver. It's happened to you, you expect that, maybe you know how to deal with it. But if the just regular person gets in a car accident and their car rolls over, it may impact them very differently because of the context, right? So that history, that context, and of course, if there are protective factors like a supportive environment, friends. There's some literature that says a child or a person needs just one other person. And what if you're it? Right? We want to be that person. So just one other can really shift whether or not the person has trauma symptomology or not. Teachers, cover your ears. I would not use a standardized assessment for social pragmatics. I would use analog. Let me just say that there aren't standardized assessments for pragmatics. There's one that's used a lot, but really it focuses on, I don't know if I can say the name of it, Test of Pragmatic Language, focuses on someone's ability to read a context and make a prediction of how they might respond. That is not social pragmatic. It's like involves the cognition, the thinking part. But what we need is the ability to see how children are responding, or individuals are responding in the moment, what actually happens and how they respond. I will use analog assessments, observations, have them engage in behaviors and social interactions with others where you're observing and you're recording with their behaviors in those contexts where they need to use social pragmatic communication. My 2 cents. The child who did the beating up actually was not a preferred play partner. When she would go into the housekeeping corner, everybody else would leave. They wouldn't sit next to her in circle time. And so she was always kind of ostracized, and they didn't understand. I went to get the girl who did the beating up. I just kind of picked her up, brought her outside, and then the teacher went and repaired the relationship with the girl, with the other child who got the beating up, and just explained to her that she didn't mean that. We have to, be patient, that we apologized. And then during circle time, there was a lesson about being kind to our friends, but the girl who did the offending wasn't there. She had that lesson individually. Now, had it not been such an obvious trigger, what we would have done is have the child who did the beating up apologize to the child to make repair, make amends, talk about, kind of recount how we should treat our friends and help them work out whatever that situation was. But this was such an obvious trigger, because I could just see it in her body, that it didn't feel right to make her apologize for being scared, or feeling vulnerable at that moment. So that's how probably better ways, but that's how we did it. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you.